Today we're going to be learning about some LGBTQ history.
Can anybody answer? Can anybody tell us when gay people were invented?
Ellen.
1982. Okay, class. So the popular narrative might have you believe that gay people were invented either at Stonewall in the 60s or during the AIDS crisis in the 80s. Well, that is not true. Some of you might be familiar with Sappho from the island of Lesbos in ancient Greece, and probably many of you are aware of more recent LGBTQ plus history. But today, we're going to talk about LGBTQ plus people in the 1920s.
What happened in the 20s?
There's so much that happened in the 20s.
Like what?
The 1920s have been referred to as the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of general sexual exploration, a lot of sort of social liberalism. The citizens defied prohibition. They really kind of amped up their crazy, lively, and secretive nightlives, especially in larger cities around the world.
So Harlem is a lovely place in New York. It was the hotbed of 1920s culture, the jazz age, all that stuff, all that jazz, if you will.
So New York City was really like you kind of, I think you said a hotbed.
Hotbed.
A hotbed of the burgeoning LGBTQ plus community. Especially in Harlem and also in Greenwich Village, were two sort of concentrated areas of this sort of culture.
Blues music was popular in speakeasies and bars and was sung by predominantly African Americans who were still struggling to be fully accepted. Straight, rich white people would entertain themselves listening to it, but were still unaccepting of their culture. Lesbians such as Gertrude Ma Rainey defied traditional femininity by wearing clothes marketed for men and singing about female love interests. In her song Prove It On Me, her lyrics say, "It's true, I wear a collar and a tie, talk to the girls just like an old man." Another example is Bessie Smith, who sang, "When you see two women walking hand in hand, just look them over and try to understand. We'll go to those parties, have the lights down low, only those parties where women can go."
We got Libby Holman, a celebrated singer of the 20s, who was married to a man, but nevertheless came to Harlem, where she could not only act as a lesbian, but even be outrageously gay. Outrageously. Her and one of her lovers, Louisa Carpenter DuPont Jenny, they would both visit Harlem almost nightly during one period, both dressed in identical men's dark suits and bowler hats, which they probably wouldn't have been able to wear, otherwise. But they were joined by other women celebrities and high livers of the time. Most of them were also married to men, but they were out for a good time. Some examples were Beatrice Lilly, Tallulah Bankhead, Jean Eagles, Marilyn Miller, and Lucille Desseur, who later became Joan Crawford.
Crawford.
Whoa!
Wow.
Whoa!
Wow. Let's talk about drag. So drag balls started in 1869 as masquerade balls, but took off during Prohibition, a time when people were actively seeking out ways to disregard rules. Got all these rules, gotta disregard them.
It's the 20s.
Now, unlike the rest of the 20s, because it was the 20s, drag balls were big, extravagant, glam, and vibrant. They involved men dressing in feminine clothing, and they were judged on dancing, walking, attire, attributes, and performances.
But things still had to be pretty underground. These drag ball lesbian artists had to be pretty underground, and the parties were sort of on the DL, a little bit secretive, because there's still kind of a dominating culture that was very conservative and religious at the time, and sort of wanted to censor these things from the general public.
Yeah,
Drag
there you
balls were also attended by straight white rich citizens as they used to entertain themselves. It was called the pansy craze because they would gawk and spectate at these drag balls and this blues music.
We're learning so much
We're learning
in this video.
This is an educational video on a wide breadth of topics.
Mm-hmm.
Is your fave Henry Ford problematic?
Yeah.
Probably. So this pansy craze ended at the start of the Great Depression as mainstream society blamed the exploration of the 20s and 30s on the economic crisis.
But they blamed this sort of like wildly socially liberal period of the 20s. They blamed that for the Great Depression in some ways.
Mostly because like men from traditional families were losing their jobs, and so they were blaming the non-traditional people on them losing their traditional lives.
Gotta have a scapegoat.
That's
Exactly.
true. That's true.
A lot of these underground communities were sort of stomped out. Their bars were closed. Gay people were banned from being portrayed in the media, like film and like in novels and on Broadway.
We got the Hays Code, this big code of rules and regulations surrounding film to make sure that everything in our media was moral and good and could be watched by children.
Yeah.
So while gay stuff was not technically outlawed, it was filed under sexual indecency in the Hays Code, and it was kind of like generally understood that that's what that meant.
So it's not that gay people weren't around during this time. As we can see that in the 20s, actually, LGBTQ plus communities were kind of.
They were there.
They were there.
They were having a good time.
They were definitely there, and they were starting to kind of even work towards acceptance. And then economic hardships hit, and World War II hit, and those communities had to kind of go underground. And a lot of the works and the works of media, art and whatnot were suppressed during this time. So only larger cities was this very prevalent culture, and so it wasn't very widespread and it wasn't too well documented. And on top of that, in the coming decades, people kind of almost wanted to forget this time. It was sort of a more lean towards conservatism, traditionalism in American society. So in regards to queer history in the 20th century, especially the 1920s, which we're talking about right now, there's kind of two issues with why there's such a big gap in that time. The first issue is that the queer community was very underground during this time. Even though it kind of did reach a prevalence in the 1920s, it was still a very underground thing. And also, the record keeping of this time in this community wasn't great, and the people that did keep records of this community were a lot of times outsiders, which kind of created a biased view of this time. And queer people weren't even allowed to tell their own stories because of things like the Hays Code. So let's answer our question. Did gay people exist before the 1980s?
Yes.
Yes, they did. All right.
Thanks.
We got you. We did it.
We got you.
We got so much
Let's opposite
footage
action. Cut.
that will hopefully turn into something.